Welcome to Columbia County Progress, a podcast sponsored by the Democratic Party of Columbia County, Wisconsin, to help move Wisconsin forward. In each episode, we'll interview community members, local leaders, elected officials, and candidates. I'm your host, Jim Hazley. I'm joined today by Mark Stover, our esteemed chair of the Communications Committee.
And today we're talking with Cassie Steiner, who is the senior campaign coordinator of the Sierra Club of Wisconsin. Cassie's been involved in a variety of different organizations that have come together to deal with the impact of hyperscale data centers in the state of Wisconsin. And she's particularly focused on the environmental impacts and what the data centers are doing for the state of Wisconsin. So good morning, Cassie. It's so nice to have you here. I thought what we would do is start out a little bit with letting the listeners know a little bit more about you. So can you talk a little bit about your background, your experience, and what brought you to the Sierra Club?
Sure. I've been with the Sierra Club for a little over 10 years now. It was my first job out of college. I was a temporary part-time apprentice. But prior to that, I was a volunteer. There was a large oil pipeline that was being expanded near Whitewater's campus, and I met Sierra Club volunteers and staff through that and started as a volunteer after I graduated, moved to Madison, and yeah, they liked me enough to keep me around, fortunately.
Well, that's good. Now, you're the campaign coordinator for the Sierra Club. What does the campaign coordinator do? What is that role?
It's a very large range of things that I work on. So, everything from campaign planning and research and figuring out the process for how decisions are made on the issues that we care about, to figuring out how we can influence decision makers to make choices that are healthier and better for the environment and for the public, and then implementing that with
Yeah.
volunteers. So there's a broad range of pieces of the role. Most of my time is working with community members and volunteers who care about the environment but don't know on their own how to influence the decisions that are being made. Often it feels like without them. And so our role is connecting people who care about nature, care about the outdoors and public health to these decisions that are happening.
Okay, that's great. And when we talk about campaigns, we're talking about both the efforts of the Sierra Club itself as well as political campaigns. Is that fair?
Yes, we do political campaign work. We have candidates that we endorse, but I use that language. I meant more so issue campaigns. So
Gotcha.
stopping a gas plant, protecting a park, specific goals
Okay.
in areas we care about.
Okay. Well, a little bit later, we'll talk about some of the bills that were before the legislature earlier this year before the assembly decided to call it a year. And so I want to come back to that part of campaigns in general. But so we're talking today about data centers and specifically with respect to the growth of these hyperscale data centers. And the reason why is, of course, for training AI. But let's talk a little bit about the difference in types of data centers, if you can. What are we've got a bunch of people that are listening today wondering what the heck is a hyperscale data center? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So there are a lot of different types of data centers, which is why the descriptor hyperscale is so important to this discussion. Data centers could be as small as a server room in a hospital or a university. So when you look at a map of data centers in Wisconsin, the scale of them is dramatically different. Some of these data centers are quite small and affiliated with schools or hospitals usually to process the information that is necessary. The hyperscale data centers are a scale altogether different. These are massive. We're talking one facility using the amount of power as the city of LA or the city of Orlando with right, which includes an
Yeah.
international airport. So
Yeah.
the magnitude of this is completely different. So hyperscale data centers are large scale facilities. Usually we're talking 100 megawatts or more. The proposals in Wisconsin are in the gigawatt magnitude, which 1 gigawatt is the city of Orlando's power use to sort of understand how big that is.
Yeah.
So some of these proposals are 2 or 3 gigawatts. And it would likely double or quadruple even the power use in Wisconsin.
Could somebody go over for me how gigawatts compare to megawatts?
Multiply a megawatt times 1,000.
Okay.
It's millions to billions.
Millions to, okay. Okay. Thank you.
I've got that right, don't I, Cassie?
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that another way of looking at scale here is there's a big steel manufacturing company over in Saukville called Charter Steel. And up until recently, they've been considered to be the largest energy user in the state at about 70 meg. Still, we're talking massive amounts of energy being used. And we'll want to come back to that in terms of what happens with the grid. So the hyperscale data centers are specifically designed not only to provide data processing for large companies like Meta or Google, but also to train AI. I don't know if you're familiar with or you want to talk a little bit about what the process is for training AI and why that takes so much power.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar on that
Okay.
aspect. Um, but I know that some of the proposals in Wisconsin are also security or surveillance facilities, not just AI training. Some are cloud storage. So there's a variety of uses for these data centers. But yeah, some of the biggest proposals we're seeing in Wisconsin are for surveillance.
Say more about that, if you will. Surveillance in terms of, I'm not familiar with that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so all of the facial recognition, video storage, connecting the like ring camera footage to police. It's yeah, sort of all of this information that tracks individual citizens and
Okay.
non-citizens as well.
Okay. Yeah, that I've heard concerns about flock cameras that are tracking, vehicles going in and out of cities and things. I guess I was less familiar with the idea that the data centers were also dealing with surveillance. So thank you. That's good to know. Um, so we've got these large data centers, and what are there, 8 or 9 now in the state that are either proposed or operating? Is that about right?
Yes.
Um,
So for hyperscale data centers, I think there are, yeah, 7 or 8 active proposals, but this changes pretty rapidly
yeah.
as communities are pushing back. And as far as data centers that are currently built in Wisconsin, there's around 50 of them, but they are all data centers, not hyperscale data centers.
Right, right, right. Yeah, we should be clear. Going forward here in the conversation, when we use the broad term data center, we're going to be focusing on hyperscale data centers, not the server farms that we talked about earlier. Just to cover, in case we aren't perfectly accurate in talking, for the education of people who are listening, who is behind these data centers? Do we know which companies they are? Are they all private industry?
We don't always know what companies they are, but in general, the biggest ones that people will recognize the names of are Facebook. So Meta is the parent company of Facebook and
Right,
Instagram. So Meta, Microsoft, Google, right? These are names that consumers are used to hearing, and these are a lot of the biggest hyperscale proposals. Um, but yeah, and a challenge is that there's often a development company that is sort of the in between, and so a lot of the contracts might not say Microsoft on them specifically, but it might be the name of the development company
right.
in the meantime. So, pulling through who is behind, who the end customer is on the development side is another layer of challenges that NDAs complicate as well.
Yeah, yeah. And in addition to data centers that are built by Meta for Meta's use, for instance, or Google's or any of the other large media things, I know there are companies like QTS that had a proposal for a data center in northern Dane County in the town of Vienna and village of DeForest. QTS is something they call a co-location data center. So unlike the other kinds of data centers, they sort of rent their space out. If do I have that right?
Yep, that is right. Yep. So
Okay.
there's often these hyperscale facilities that have one very large customer, or it's almost like a office rental model
Yeah,
where it's
yeah.
a large server
Mhm.
room and companies might rent certain percentage of the
Okay.
capacity.
So,
Mm.
so with these hyperscale data centers, they are going to put, as we talked about, a gigawatt or more of demand on the grid. Is Wisconsin ready to provide, or is the Midwest service provider ready to provide multiple gigawatts of power to these new proposals?
Not currently, and the result we are seeing is a lot of mostly gas plant proposals, as well as some financial dealings for companies to buy power from existing renewable on the grid so that they can claim that they're powered by renewable energy, while at the same time that just dirties the grid for residential customers. So they're sort of sucking up or claiming every clean megawatt to say that they're not using fossil fuels, and meanwhile it leaves the rest of us with the fossil fuel mix. So there's a huge energy demand. It's driving a lot of new infrastructure projects, some of which are being built on speculation, and we might be stuck holding the bag for that. There's huge impacts to energy costs for everyday people in Wisconsin because of these things. That said, part of the reason that these hyperscale data center developers and businesses are looking at Wisconsin are because we do have a more resilient electrical grid than some states in the country. We do have obviously a lot of water with the Great Lakes.
Yeah,
And then the cooler seasons in Wisconsin mean they don't need to uh, cool the facility as much for part of the year. So those are
yeah.
sort of, and then we have tax incentives. Well, those are the four reasons that they're looking here, and our power grid is one of those four.
Gas plants is one way that some of the utilities are thinking about being able to meet this increased demand. I've heard that gas plants can actually be more detrimental to the climate based on emissions. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that affects the climate?
Yeah. The main pollutant from gas plants is methane.
Hmm.
Methane can be up to 80 times as strong an impact on the climate as carbon. And so we are seeing in the life cycle of gas similar negative impacts to the climate and to the environment. For people who live near gas plant facilities, there are a lot of the same negative impacts to respiratory health, concerns about cancer, and different air pollutants that there are with coal. Um, it's at a slightly different magnitude at the source of generation.
Okay.
Um, but because you can't see the pollutant from gas the way you can see coal ash or coal dust, the response is very different. And so a
Yeah.
lot of these pollutants that are in the air, um, aren't being adequately understood by decision makers and community members.
Well, and the methane emissions don't just stick around in the community that the gas plant is in either. They're blown around by the winds and affect other people as well. So even if you don't have a data center being proposed in your community, you may very well still be affected by some of the downstream effects. Um, so let's turn to the water. You mentioned one of the reasons for the attraction to Wisconsin is that we have the Great Lakes. We've got a lot of water in the state. Water is used as in many of these data centers. It's used as a cooling mechanism. Can you talk a little bit about the demand for water that the data centers would put on, and what some of the effects then are of what happens with the water once it's been through the data center?
Yeah. So data centers can use different types of systems for cooling all of the servers. The two most common right now are open loop and closed loop systems.
Okay.
So open loop, the water flows through the facility for cooling and then is released back out. Um, main challenge that comes with that is thermal pollution or heat pollution from the water being released back out into either wastewater facilities or sometimes even right back into um the river
The
or
river,
lake
yeah.
that it's pulling from. um and the the thermal pollution can cause problems for wildlife, different algal blooms that many times are toxic, just disrupts the balance of the ecosystem in a really substantial way. So and it uses so much water. So
Yeah.
the large water use from those facilities, are also seeing local wells or neighboring houses having water quantity problems because the data center is running through so much water. So that is the open loop. Closed loop is essentially a water recycling process. So they reuse the water um, for cooling. They have to cool the water in that process. And so what winds up happening is there's more electrical use needed for a closed loop system. And in
Okay.
Wisconsin, 71% of our water use goes to energy generation for coal and gas. And
Already.
so adding these facilities, even if they're using closed loop systems, which they claim are so much better, it really is just shifting the water use problem offsite and at power generation facilities, especially if there's not new clean energy supporting the power demand that comes with this.
So, yeah, that's an interesting statistic that 70% of our water usage in the state is already being used by power plants for electric generation. I did not know that. That's really interesting. Is
Thank you for emphasizing that, because I was going to ask Cassie to repeat that. That astounds me.
Well, that's why we have these experts. They're so good at
Well,
this.
I'm with you there.
Um,
Yes, and I have to give credit where it's due. That number comes from a report by Clean Wisconsin looking at water use at data centers. Um, and I also think I made this point but skimmed it really fast. There's not water use necessary for wind and solar. And so
right.
the energy generation we're talking about for high water usage is coal and gas, it's fossil fuels. So that's another layer of why the clean energy piece is so important as part of this puzzle.
Right, right. So I know with respect to wind and solar, there have been some discussions, as you mentioned earlier in the conversation, about making sure that data centers are powered at a certain percentage. I think one of the bills that was before the Assembly and Senate earlier this spring said something like 75% needed to be coming from renewables. Uh, for those of us who don't know as much about the availability of renewable energy, is there enough on the grid from renewables to be able to support this huge energy demand? It's still going to need to be supplemented, right?
Yes. So in general, these hyperscale data centers will need more generation in general because it's quadrupling the amount of power
Right.
demanded. So our grid certainly doesn't have that amount of megawatts available for use, regardless of where they're coming from. Solar and wind, when paired with battery storage, can support most of the needs, probably up to around 85%
Okay.
of the power needs from hyperscale data centers pretty easily.
Okay.
And
That's good.
renewable energy with battery storage is the fastest to build, fastest to deploy, and most cost effective option for power. So there's a lot of benefits that can come with clean energy, both for the public and for the data centers themselves. Challenge that enters the picture is that because it's not as costly, utilities are not making as much of a profit. They're making the same percentage of a profit, but the number of the profit is smaller than with gas plants. So there's an
Okay.
incentive for utilities to build more expensive infrastructure because that's how they make their profit.
Because there's a return on equity that they're promised by the PSC, right? Yeah. So the more equity you have in buildings and whatnot, the more you have in your 10% return or whatever it is.
Mhm.
Okay, that's very interesting. That's another angle that I think is not well understood. So thanks for raising that one up. So we've talked. I want to go back to the environmental issues here a little bit. So we've talked about the water issues and the thermal discharge. Um, I want to talk a little bit about the closed loop water systems. So I've heard people talk about the closed loop water systems as being kind of like the radiator in your car. There's some chemicals in there as well that will help to lengthen the life expectancy of the cooling power of the water. Is there concern about discharge of those chemicals? Are those chemicals something we should be concerned about?
Yes, one of the challenges with a lot of these decisions happening under NDAs or the guise of being trade secrets is that we do not always know what
Oh,
chemicals are
gotcha.
being used in this process. There is rising concerns that PFAS or forever chemicals are used in in the process, and these are known carcinogens. We don't have a way to eliminate them once they are produced and added into the natural environment or our water systems. And so there is growing concern about the number of PFAS that are being put into the water through the
Yeah,
closed
yeah.
loop systems. And it is not an issue yet that's well understood. And it's been a lot of citizens who become citizen scientists and learn how to water test and things to find the problems that are happening with some of these data centers.
Yeah, especially if you're on a private well, it's even more important. But I expect that the amount of water that's being pulled out of the system and run through even municipal water systems is putting them under some strain as well. Do the municipal water systems have the capability of being able to handle this increased? Or I guess where I'm going is, do the data centers draw from municipal water systems? So there's increased pressure on them then too.
Yes, that's right. And so there's increased concern there with the amount of use. A lot of municipal water systems have a cap for water use per day that is much higher than what the community is already using. And
Okay.
because of that, data centers are able to come in and lock quite low water rates in because it's within the allowable amount for municipal water systems to use per day. They're not
Okay.
changing what that threshold is. So a lot of the water use decisions are happening without public input, without scrutiny, and without a lot of cost to the data centers at this point in time because they're fitting right under thresholds that are already set in place for water use.
Which, though, if there's any additional demand from the city for, residential or other manufacturing or business, would then put additional stress on the water system. So, okay, that's also good to know. Were you going to add something?
I was just gonna say, yeah, that's where the strain comes in and,
Yeah.
where right, if there's population growth or water demand growth from residents,
Right.
they're often gonna be the ones to foot the bill for the next wave of infrastructure that needs to be built to better handle that
Right.
demand.
Right.
And so, yeah, the data center developers are quite clever at finding, every threshold and making sure there's just under it, which is really where a lot of the regulation is failing in the state.
Yeah, let's talk about that for just a second because I was reading some stuff recently about uh, trying to make definitions about what is a data center in terms of energy use. I think I've heard things that a base of 10,000 square feet in one facility, as a minimum, and something like 5,000 servers on site would be sort of the minimum threshold that would define a hyperscale data center. And if you talk about the amount of energy being used at the gigawatt level, um, that blows things out of the water, literally. But if you set the standard at like 500 megawatts, half a gigawatt, if a data center just sets its operating level at 400 megawatts, then they're right under the threshold. There's no problem, but they're, what, 10 times, 15 times the size of the largest energy users now. What can we do about that?
Yeah, that definition is really critical for us to get right. And I
Okay.
think you pointing out how the largest user is around 70 or 75 megawatts currently displays just how large these are. And if we don't get this right, it means we're going to have a lot of proposals coming in just under, and we should learn from other states that are tackling hyperscale data center influxes and sort of how they're deciding to regulate these concerns. Even the Department of Energy itself qualifies anything larger than 20 megawatts as a
Oh,
large
really?
user. And
Oh, really?
so when we're talking 20 megawatts versus 500 megawatts,
Yeah.
the magnitude's different.
Yeah.
And a lot of other states are setting their definition of a large user in that 20 to 50 megawatt range. So 100 megawatts is even kind of larger than some of our peers
Right.
around the country. But it considers some of the high use users that already are in Wisconsin. Some of our manufacturing is quite large scale customers already.
Right.
But missing how we're quantifying what that threshold is means that there are going to be a lot of extremely large users that could fall just under that threshold, bring a lot of the same problems to the grid and to our infrastructure, and they're not regulated to protect all of us. And so
Right.
that definition is so important to get right.
Let's talk a little bit about this uh, um, process by which these data centers get proposed to local municipalities, since we're talking about comparing size. We have seen some reports lately about the number of NDAs, as you mentioned, that are involved with these data center developments. What are the NDAs actually doing? Why do they need to have an NDA in? Oh, and I guess we should say that an NDA is a non-disclosure agreement. So we've got that definition.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
My brain was working hard on that one, Mark. So
Non-disclosure agreements typically are, you can't talk about something and they put it in the context of competitive secrecy for the companies.
okay.
But what are some of the other issues with NDAs, Cassie?
Some of the biggest concerns with non-disclosure agreements are just cutting the public out of the process. So there is not information given publicly to neighbors to these proposals, to other Wisconsinites whose lives are going to be impacted by uh, a hyperscale data center coming in to the state. Sometimes it even limits information that decision makers have. If there's an NDA signed between city staff and a company, it is possible that the city council does not have access to that information, and they're the ones voting on zoning permits and the such. So it is mostly a transparency issue. And a huge concern is that a lot of these NDAs expand far beyond the legal definition of what a trade
Hmm.
secret actually is. They're using that phrase in a very expansive way to not release information for members of the public and decision makers to scrutinize what's going on and to understand what's going on. Those are key concerns. Another part of this is that what we've seen in some of the proposals in Wisconsin are that there have long been negotiations happening between the city and the developer that nobody knows about, sometimes for years, because of these NDAs. And there's already a handshake agreement, or sometimes it's
Hmm.
something even more formal in place before it comes to the public's attention or even city council attention. And so we're seeing um, a, a lot of decisions being made without scrutiny, without public input, and with a lot of secrecy. And I think most people want to know, what are you hiding from us?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I understand that Beaver Dam, for instance, the development that's going on up there was sort of a case study in how NDAs and these other handshake agreements can be exclusive of community input. Do you have any other insights into the Beaver Dam development in particular along those lines?
I just know that a lot of the information didn't come out until contracts were being signed.
Yeah,
And that is why a lot of people are so upset. They didn't have an opportunity to advocate for themselves and for their neighbors.
right.
Another piece of this is, even in the Public Service Commission docket or case where they're deciding how much the Beaver Dam data center is paying, any information they put out publicly had anything relevant to what the data center is going to pay redacted. So the
Ah,
company name, their energy demand, the length of term of the contract, the price that they're paying, right? All of that was redacted. And then the public was asked to comment on it. And there's just not information there to
yeah,
make sure that this large customer is paying for 100% of their expenses, and that it's not going to be shifted to other customers. And the data center said that all of that is trade secrets.
yeah.
Fortunately, the public did a really nice job pointing out how absurd this is. And the Public Service Commission is requiring Alliant Energy to repost their um, their contract with fewer redactions. So hopefully there's some substance that the public can look at soon. But same company. It's the Beaver Dam data center that this is about, and um, you know, it's absurd for them to say, "Hey, trust us, we're gonna pay
Yeah.
our fair share," but then we can't even know what the length of the contract is.
Right. Yeah. My comment on the what I saw would be, well, there's awful lot of black spots on the documents that I was looking at. I couldn't read it. So um, let's switch our topic here, or our focus here just a little bit. We've talked about the water issues. We've talked about discharge issues. We've talked quite a bit about the power issues here. Let's focus on the development that's taking place on the land itself. Speaking about Beaver Dam, I live not far from there, and it's just outside of Columbia County. One of the things that I've noticed is that it's a huge amount of land that's under construction, and I have to say, it looks like it's pretty much a big kind of parking lot or gravel pit. Can you talk a little bit about the impacts, environmental impacts to the land on the development of these large scale data centers, these hyperscales?
Yeah, on the land directly, it's a lot of concerns with other development, but again, the scale is so much bigger, and so therefore
Hmm.
the associated problems are bigger. When these data centers are going in, they're taking a lot of land. And so that comes with concerns about what else could that land have been used for the
Right.
community, whether it's for agriculture or a park or even housing developments. There are, right, many options that land can be used for, and instead it is this one large facility. So it's the scale of it is a concern. Um, Anytime that there's a large impervious surface or a surface
Hmm.
that water can't get through, there are concerns about water runoff, flooding, related pollution because of water not being able to be reabsorbed. And so
Right.
that has a
Hmm.
big concern on land, especially because so much of Wisconsin is wetlands. So we're really altering the characteristics of our ecosystems when we're paving so much.
Right.
Um, and the affiliated traffic during construction, there's of course a lot of air pollution and particulate matter from
Hmm.
all of the dust that it's kicking up. I know neighbors to the facility are already having huge problems with the dust that is coating their houses and their cars, and of course they're breathing it in as well.
Right.
Um, and then and other pieces that go along with that land use are um, the light pollution and sound pollution that come with these facilities.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so the light pollution can vary very dramatically depending on local ordinances, but it's sort of a requirement of local governments to proactively protect um, wildlife and human life from a lot of light pollution. And so some of these are lit up like football fields, and
Yeah.
some of
Yeah.
these have, you know, warmer light bulbs. They're LEDs, but they're warmer in color. There's a cap over them so that light isn't going directly up into the air. There's limits. There might be dimmers or timers. So these are best practices that can decrease some of the light coming from these. But in general, anytime you have large development and you're adding more light, that's going to disrupt, the light around the community, which can impact sleep cycles and mental health.
Right.
And then wildlife, of course, especially migratory birds and insects, are really impacted by light pollution.
Yeah, and I suppose the what do you call them? The animals that are out and about at night. It's suddenly not ever night anymore. Why do the data centers need this much light? What's the rationale behind that?
Great question. Most often, I would say they probably don't. These um, are facilities that often do not have a lot of human employees.
Right.
And so light is there for human employees. And so it's a safety measure for the people that are there. The
Right.
concern is if you don't adjust the lighting appropriately, you're putting in an awful lot of light for very few workers. Not that workplace conditions should be unsafe or not well
Right.
lit,
Of course.
but including things like motion sensors and dimmers and timers to more appropriately scale when lights are on or off is a really sort of simple and inexpensive um, it's not a full solution, but it improves
But
the
it helps.
situation.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about noise pollution too, and I think that I've heard some things about the fact that these data centers aren't just a building sitting quietly on the prairie; they're humming. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, they're humming again. The range of sound pollution, it varies quite a bit,
Hmm.
and largely can be adapted based on local ordinances, which is why proactive protections at the local level are so important here. Um, but the humming is dang near constant.
Yeah.
And it is somewhere in the decibel range that's between normal conversation and someone yelling in your ear. And so that is sort of the scale of noise that we're talking about. It's quite a range that they can have. And things like setback requirements, space around the data center, to make
Hmm.
sure it's further from neighbors or residential areas. Having, right now, a lot of these data centers are running 20 or set up to run 24/7,
Yeah.
having times where they're off or running partial capacity to decrease the noise overnight or something, right? There are different things that can be required to help with this. And a lot of the noise depends on what type of cooling system is being used as well.
Yeah.
So, Cassie, could you explain a little bit more for me about where does the noise come from? What's causing that?
Yeah, some of it is the servers themselves. So if you, this is, um, I compare it to older TVs where you could hear them turn on the static.
Hmm.
It's not the same
Yeah.
process, and I'm not an electrician, but it's a similar thing where
Sure.
like the servers are emitting some noise when they're on. Um, And then, of course, the cooling process, the electrical use, all of that emits some level of noise as well. But a lot of it is from sort of this constant on electrical humming
Yeah.
is a good word for it.
So I think that's actually one of the parts of the impact on environments that we don't hear as much about. And I'm glad you brought that up. The noise pollution is definitely an issue for not only neighbors but for um, just the workers and people in general. So
Can you give us a little more specific information about the humming, like the
mm,
range of decibels?
I think over 70 decibel is where hearing damage
yeah,
can start with long-term exposure. And a lot of these are between 60 and 95 decibels. So many of them are above that range that is harmful to human hearing.
yeah.
And so that distance from the facility really impacts the exposure that members of the public might have to the sound from the facilities.
So this is a good transition into another issue that we're dealing with. And, Cassie, you were talking earlier about non-disclosure agreements for city councils.
Oh,
One of the things that is of concern in Wisconsin is zoning regulations. And so if you don't have a zoning regulation, for instance, that says you have to have a setback and you have to have berms or, trees planted or whatever
yeah.
to break down sound travel,
Hmm.
then there's no regulation. And I've heard some things about the new development in Cassville over on the Mississippi River, because I believe Cassville is a small village and it doesn't have zoning requirements, and so that's making it easier to do a lot of things. What can municipalities do with respect to zoning to help them control this growth?
Yeah, so we'll come back to Cassville. That's a unique
Okay,
situation.
good.
But for municipalities, so cities, towns, villages that have zoning mechanisms in place, doing proactive zoning updates and ordinance updates is really critical, and getting
Mhm.
these protections in place before a proposal even comes really helps in the process to make sure that the developer has the community's intentions a bit more at heart, and is willing to work to mitigate the risks.
Yeah,
And so some of the examples of zoning changes can include things like lighting, setbacks,
ah,
how loud things are allowed to be. Um, they can require disclosure of water use or power use
yeah,
in a more proactive way. There's a lot of things that can be done in really creative ways to require good faith development.
yeah,
Um, and so having that in place before a proposal is there is so important. And a good example for uh, a community that didn't have that in place is Menominee, Wisconsin, where a proposal
ah,
came in. Community members were really concerned. Um, the decision makers were not ready to say no data center ever at all. But they said, we hear your concerns. We're going to pause data center development to get the codes right so that if one is built here, there are protections in place for everybody. And so their development of their zoning codes and their ordinances is ongoing now. But that is a great example that I think a lot of communities in Wisconsin should follow. And the research being done by community members to get that ordinance right has been astonishing. Looking at all these codes from other states,
Yeah.
recommendations from experts, there's a lot that can be done. And I think Menominee is a really good example of that. Um,
It sounds like some of the things that you're concerned about in the zoning has to do with ensuring that the company coming in hoping to have a facility like this enhance their bottom line, that there are some guarantees that they're also going to be responsible for the costs when the facility is operating, and even if there are any if there are any implications for costs beyond the operational life of the facility. Do you have other examples where a facility has gone, or a facility has reached the end of its useful life, and those costs have been put upon citizens or municipalities?
yes, this happens a lot with power generation for some
Yeah.
reasons I
Oh,
mentioned earlier. So
Yeah.
there are a number of coal plants in Wisconsin that are uneconomic and were going to be uneconomic quickly after they were built. And advocates like Sierra Club and neighbors to the plants tried to stop new development of these coal plants. They were put in anyway, and now we're still paying for them, even though they're what's called stranded assets. So
Right.
there's cost that needs to be recovered. Um, and we're stuck holding the bag, and so that is the concern with some of this as well.
Yeah. And the reason that we're stuck holding the bag is that the utilities are promised that return on equity over a period of time. And so even if the generator is no longer delivering power to people, but it hasn't finished its useful life as it was originally designed, we still pay for that in order for the utility to receive their 10% promised return on equity.
oh,
So stranded assets are a big deal from a standpoint of cost to all consumers across the state. And if Cassie can correct me, please, if I'm wrong, but I think there's something like currently in Wisconsin $1 billion of stranded assets that we are all paying for. Now comes out fairly small every month on your utility bill, but you're still paying for it.
okay. Thank
Um,
you. Thank you.
yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of aspects to this.
Mm.
I wanted to come back to something I think that our producers here were talking with me about before, and that is artificial intelligence, which is one of the things that's driving these hyperscale developments, as well as the surveillance issues, as well as just being. We live in the 21st century. There's lots of data that needs to be processed and managed. So it's very unlikely that the need for these kinds of hyperscale centers is going to go away. But I think earlier in this conversation, Cassie, you started to talk about some of the ways that data centers themselves could be developed smarter, as well as, like we're just talking about, zoning can help to develop, do smarter development. Can we expand on that just a little bit? What are some of the other things you think would be good for the state to be thinking about in terms of smarter development?
Yeah, for the state specifically, I think a lot of the things that we've talked about already, water use, power use, land use, sound, and light are kind of the main
Okay.
immediate categories. But a piece of your question is this demand really going to go away? Do we really need these things to begin with? And I think that
Yeah.
is up for debate still.
Okay.
Um, a lot of the generative AI is being forced upon customers. There's not
Yeah.
easy ways to turn it off. And so you're not opting in to use a tool. It is being integrated without your consent.
Right.
And that is driving a lot of this demand. So there are, I think, also on the consumer protection side, a lot that could be done to
Okay.
allow us to have more choice over what tools we're using and when we're using them.
Oh, I
Um,
like that. Yeah.
and so that's, a much bigger piece of this. But the use of electronics, computers, smart devices, that certainly is not going away.
Right.
And in some ways it is a good thing. It is good that we have flexibility. We can connect with people across the globe, being able to Zoom into work rather than using your single occupancy vehicle on the road, right?
Yep.
There
Yep.
are pros and
Sure.
cons to this sort of development. But I think the general takeaway here is that if we are building things, how are we building them?
Right.
Are we using the best practices to protect the community, or are corners being skirted for higher profits to
Right.
gamble on AI continuing in the trajectory that has been happening?
Yeah, yeah. And I know there's a whole lot of things we can talk about with respect to the financial bubble and all of that kind of stuff. I think I'd rather stay focused on the Sierra Club here and specifically the environmental stuff. I know that the Sierra Club has been part of a group that put together something called the Big Tech Unchecked Toolkit. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and why it's a toolkit? Who's it aimed at?
Yeah, this is a toolkit that was created with Wisconsin's Green Fire, Midwest Environmental Advocates, and Healthy Climate Wisconsin, as well as Sierra
Mhm.
Club. And um, we, our organizations came together and said, holy cow, there's a lot of hyperscale data center proposals. It is in many ways like whack-a-mole, trying to focus
Yeah.
on one at a time. Um, we knew that we weren't going to suddenly be able to be actively engaged in 7 to 9 or more local fights in a really in-depth way, but we knew that we needed to share information and resources for advocates in their communities to
Okay.
ask the right questions and to know what the risks are. So Big Tech Unchecked walks through common concerns with hyperscale data centers, and then is really focused on local community members, even at like city councilors and things
Hmm.
like that, who want to know what questions to ask to make the right decisions. Um, and then there's a section in here for concerned citizens about how do you organize your community? What are best practices for talking to press?
Mm-hmm.
How do you testify at a public hearing? What the heck is the Public Service Commission and what do they have
Yeah,
to do
yeah.
with all of this? So it sort of walks through these different pieces, the risks from hyperscale data centers, the process for the decisions that are being made, and then different intervention points the public can use.
So the toolkit sounds like it's really designed for lots of different folks, not just city councils, but people that are interested in their community. How does one get a hold of this toolkit?
Yes, it is called Big Tech Unchecked. And if you Google that, especially paired with Sierra Club, it'll come up for you. Um, and we have a web page on Sierra Club's website that not only has a link to the full toolkit, but also has subsections so that you don't have to download the whole toolkit at once. If you just want to know about zoning ordinances, you can download
Okay.
just that page.
Okay. So that's sierraclub.org that people
Yeah.
should go to? Okay. Sierraclub.org
sierraclub.org/Wisconsin. Yep.
slash Wisconsin. Thank you.
I do have a question. You brought up city councils a few times, and in the context of non-disclosure agreements, do you have examples where city councils have not had or have non-disclosure agreements have prevented a city council from having full information, and yet those counselors have been expected to make a decision?
Yes. Yep. There are
Mhm.
definitely elected decision makers who don't have access to the same level of information as some of the city staff might or the mayor might. Um, so yeah, there are
Okay.
absolutely situations where even people making the decisions don't have access to all of the information.
Okay. I would certainly hope that an elected representative would not be willing to vote on a proposal one way or the other unless they had full information available to them. So,
So that actually leads me into another area I want to go into, and then I want to come back to also the no discounts for data centers material that's on the website sierraclub.org/Wisconsin. I know that there's a lot of municipalities that are strapped for cash, and mostly it's volunteers, pretty much running the city council. What does the Sierra Club recommend the state do in terms of legislation to protect some of those local municipalities more?
Yeah, we were engaged in the legislative session on the different pieces of data center legislation that have moved forward. Uh, so one was Senate Bill 729, which was introduced by Angela Stroud and Jody Havish-Sinekin.
Hmm.
Sierra Club has registered in support of that
Okay.
because it has a very thoughtful they did a lot of intentional or stakeholder engagement
Yeah.
prior to releasing the legislation. They worked very closely with the Public Service Commission about what needs to be codified to make sure that residents are not subsidizing these data centers through their energy
Yeah.
bills. And so
Okay.
there's a lot of detail in that process that I think is a really good starting point. Um, some of the other requirements about needing renewable energy to qualify for the tax credits, worker protections like prevailing wage. There's a lot in this
Yeah.
bill
Yeah.
that does quite a bit of good to protect everyday Wisconsinites. Um, and so we're supportive of legislation that includes a lot of those measures and beyond. There's
Okay.
certainly more that could be included, but it's a good starting point. The flip of that is Assembly Bill um, 840, Senate
840.
Bill
Yeah.
843, which is the data center bill introduced by Republicans. It's quite short.
Hmm.
It's, I think, a page and a half total. It simply says that Wisconsinites shouldn't have to pay for data centers, which is good, but it doesn't have
Yeah.
any mechanism to make sure that that's the case. And then it
Yeah.
has a huge loophole or poison pill that disincentivizes clean energy, which, as we've talked about earlier, is more cost effective, doesn't come with the price fluctuations for fuel, and doesn't come with the pollution at the same
Yeah.
scale. So
Yeah.
that was a poison pill that for sure made us oppose that legislation.
Yeah. Do you know what the status of any of this legislation is now with I think the assembly's out, but the Senate's still in, or it's kind of confusing. What's the status?
Yes. So the assembly is out. They voted and passed Assembly Bill 840. So the
Okay.
Republican introduced legislation. Um, and but that was the only data center bill taken up by the assembly. And
Okay.
so a range of options were not really presented for legislators.
mm,
Senate had hearings at the Senate Utility Committee
Hmm.
for four different bills related to AI and data centers. So, in addition to the two I mentioned, there's one that bans NDAs, and there's another one that clarifies that AI is not a person and it can't marry or own property.
Oh, well,
Um,
that's good that we've got that.
right.
Why?
um,
Why is that important? That AI is not a person and can't marry. Is that what does that do?
well,
have you heard about corporations?
Oh well, but
Anyway,
is
yeah, I mean, Sierra Club does not have a position on that bill, but there are, examples of countries that are electing AI to lead
Oh,
their country, right? There's an AI prime minister.
I did not know
Right.
that.
And so there is a discussion and proactive planning to consider, I think, when it comes to how we view AI in terms of personhood, but that is outside of the scope of Sierra Club.
Yeah, and right now here too. So, yeah, there's the bill that was talking about no NDAs. Wasn't there a moratorium bill too, that talked about a statewide moratorium?
One has been announced and circulated, but it has not had a hearing.
Okay. So even if Senate Bill 729 was voted on and passed in the Senate, it would still have to go through the Assembly and then to the governor's desk for signature. And with the Assembly out, that doesn't seem like that's a viable path right now, unless you know something I don't know.
No, I think the only viable path for any of this to be implemented would be for an emergency session to be scheduled
Uh,
for them to come back in and really dig deep on data center
okay.
legislation. And that is something that the legislative authors of Senate Bill 729 were asking for at the hearing was
Oh, okay. Okay.
let's work together. Let's bring in an let's open a session specific to this and bring the assembly back to have these conversations. We'll see what happens. We'll see what
Okay.
happens.
All right. So stay tuned, in other words, huh?
Yes. Yep.
If people, after hearing this, I hope we've done a good enough job for people to have learned more about what AI data centers are, or data centers at the hyperscale level. If this encourages people to get more involved, what are some ways that they can do that? What do you suggest?
Yes. The very local level, working with your zoning committee and your neighbors
Okay.
to get those protective ordinances in place. That is like my number one advice for people who are concerned about their immediate communities. Um,
Zoning.
yeah, work with the
Okay.
zoning committee, get a strong ordinance in place. That is what we're seeing is the most effective way to protect folks.
Okay.
Um, Beyond that, there's a lot of policy that needs to change at the state level, both in terms of legislation and rules and decisions that agencies like the Public Service Commission and Department of Natural Resources are making. And we welcome anybody who wants to volunteer with Sierra Club to get involved with
Okay.
us to help influence those statewide policies. We have a volunteer with us page on our website, so sierraclub.org
Oh,
slash Wisconsin slash volunteer. We
okay.
welcome anybody who wants to get involved, especially at the state policy level with us. And then, show up. There are so many events, meetings, public
Yeah.
hearings. There's a lot in this process and it can be overwhelming. And so even if you can't make all of these things, if you can make some of them so that there's strong turnout to all of them that we're sharing
Yes.
together as a community, that is critical. So show up where you're able to. If you haven't testified before, it doesn't have to be as scary as it sounds, right? Put 3 bullet points on paper that you want to make sure people know about your thoughts, and share those. So really, yeah, showing up and not just to things like rallies, but also to public hearings and
Right.
city council votes. And yeah, that consistent presence is so essential.
Yeah, and there's some material in the Big Tech Unchecked toolkit about testifying, how you would do that and how that works. Is that right? Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
yep,
So
there
people can download that and take a look.
absolutely. Yes.
Okay. All right. Um, so, is there anything else you want to say with respect to the development of hyperscale data centers in the state? Anything else you think people should know? I mean, we've talked about a lot, but if there's something that we've left out that was important that you hoped we'd talk about, what would that be?
Yeah. I do wanna come back to Cassville, that
Oh,
you
yes.
mentioned.
Yes. Let's do that.
Yes, yeah,
Good.
because it is such a unique situation. So not only, are there zoning challenges because of, uh, right, Cassville not having a city council or a town board, and there being rules about, what zoning provisions can be put in place from a county on local areas. So there's challenges
Mm-hmm.
happening in how to protect Cassville residents. It's also in a rural electric cooperative territory, not an investor-owned
Oh,
utility. And so
okay.
most of these data center proposals are in investor-owned utility territory. So Alliant Energy,
Mhm.
We Energies, WPS. And these are regulated by the Public Service Commission. So there's a decision-making body in place that, in theory, is helping to protect the public. I laugh because it doesn't always play out that way, but there's at least a mechanism. With rural electric cooperatives, their customers are also members and are also part owners of the cooperative
Yeah.
model.
Mhm.
So in theory, they should hold more power. But what has wound up happening in Wisconsin is that the board is making decisions directed by the parent cooperative, Dairyland Power,
Mm.
and the member owners aren't able to access those decisions in the way that they, in theory, should be able to. And I've been asking my colleagues around the country for examples of how hyperscale data centers are being treated in rural electric cooperative territory. And
That's very
all
interesting.
I get is, I've been wondering that too. We have yet, it doesn't mean there's not something that exists, but I have not yet found somebody who has navigated how rural electric co-ops make sure that their residential and small business customers aren't subsidizing a large scale data center that comes in.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so that is a huge web that I'm trying to untangle. And, similarly, if a proposal comes up in a municipal utility territory, it'll be a similar
Mm-hmm.
question. So,
Okay.
once we figure it out with the investor owned, then they shift to, to a different
Yeah.
regulatory model to make us relearn it all over again. So,
Well, good
yeah,
for our brains, right?
right. So it
Yeah,
is
and there's
an
some.
interesting question. It's a unique situation.
Yeah, and there's something like 80 or maybe 90 municipal or cooperative utilities around the state. So I don't know if most of Wisconsin, but a large percentage of the land area is under a public power type of thing. In Columbus, where I live, we're a WIPPI
Mhm.
community, and so that brings it right home here to Columbia County too. That's very interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. That'll be another topic to be taking a look at.
Sure.
Yeah,
Um,
hopefully I eventually have more information about hyperscale data centers and co-ops, but yeah, it's that particular proposal has, a lot of barriers for public engaging in the process that are unique to
yeah,
that specific community because of how rural it is. So,
yeah. Well, and it's I've also heard just one more thing on power generation and in Cassville in particular. I've heard that there's some interest, maybe even in a nuclear power plant over in the Cassville area.
we have a lot of concerns about nuclear in general and the threats that it can pose to water and health and what we're doing with spent fuel rods and
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
disposal piece of things. But it is so costly and takes so much time that the threat to our energy bills is huge from relying on nuclear for these facilities, especially. Some of these hyperscale data centers, that we're not sure how long they'll function or how rapidly technology will change. Nuclear takes, I think, 10 years on average, at least, to
That's what
get
I've
up
heard.
and
Yeah.
going. It is possible that these facilities might be winding down even by the time that a nuclear facility is coming online. So there's just a lot of
Mm.
pieces of this puzzle that nuclear power does not tackle adequately.
Yeah, yeah. And then that nuclear power plant would become a stranded asset if it wasn't needed to support data centers that were no longer there. Would that be right too? Yeah. Okay.
Uh-huh.
I meant to come back to the fact that there are tax incentives in Wisconsin. I think the sales and use exemption tax or sales and use tax exemption is one of the main ones. Can you explain how that works and what other tax incentives there are for data centers in Wisconsin?
Yeah, I can talk very high level
Okay,
about this, but so anytime there's a tax break, it's going to incentivize that type of business coming to
sure.
Wisconsin because it's a discount that they're able to use.
Right.
It's a benefit to lure them in, and that's what the sales and use tax exemption does. The chair of the Senate Utility Commission was very clear that that was a huge reason this was passed, and why he's supportive of it is
Oh,
to get more hyperscale proposals into Wisconsin to attract these customers. And then at the local level, some local governments are also setting up tax incentive districts or tax incremental financing districts to again, lure in customers to build out these big hyperscale
yeah,
facilities
yeah.
with the idea that it would help their tax base. But all of these exemptions, with the costs that are likely to come from the facilities, just are a double whammy to members of the public who are concerned about these impacts. We're essentially cutting a deal for companies that are going to come in and harm us.
I guess I'll go back to what I was saying earlier. Is there something that we haven't talked about that's right on the cutting edge here for the Sierra Club, or for your concerns about data centers that you want to make sure people hear?
One of the main focuses for us right now, both in Wisconsin and across the country, are really engaging in these. They're called large customer tariffs, but the structure of payment
Okay.
between a data center and the utility that it's through. And some of those big decisions are happening in Wisconsin right now and will happen through the spring. And so that has been a large focus for us, making sure that data centers are paying for 100% of their infrastructure, including transmission lines, fuel that's used, and something
Hmm.
that I didn't touch on but relates to the clean energy piece. We filed a report as an exhibit in the We Energy's large customer tariff case. That's a study by Grid Lab that looks at if Wisconsin hyperscale data centers run on renewables versus gas, what are the cost impacts to all customers? So,
Oh,
regardless
interesting.
of what payment structure is in place, would gas be more expensive and risky for all customers? And the answer that report found is yes, across the board. Even without federal subsidies for clean energy, the risk from gas is much higher for all
Mm,
customers. And
okay.
so, the economics of the power, and not just the pollution or health concerns or climate concerns, um, are making the arguments for themselves that clean energy is a better solution here.
Hmm.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Grid Lab is the source of that data.
Yes.
And
Yep.
I assume a person could go online and Google Grid Lab and find out more about this.
Yes, it is called the Large Loads and Natural Gas Price Risk Study.
Okay. Well, Cassie, it's just been terrific talking to you. Yeah, I know we've been sort of ship sailing in the night, and I haven't always had a chance to talk with you directly. And I'm looking forward to having more conversations with you in the future, not only on these things, but on other things that the Sierra Club is interested in as well. Appreciate your time very much. Was there anything else that we needed to accomplish here today from this end or your end?
Probably just the closing that I think we
Okay.
mentioned at the beginning, that we'll be talking to some people that stepped up and showed up at the meetings and through advocacy around the town of Vienna data center that was
Yes.
proposed. And we'll also be talking with someone from 350 Wisconsin,
Brittany Reaver.
and she'll be able to give us some complementary information to what we've talked about here today. So we really appreciate your time. I've enjoyed having the chance to have this little bit longer conversation, and look forward that maybe someday you'll be able to meet Mark and I in person. So,
Yeah.
and the only thing I'd say about that is if that happens, just remember Mark may be taller and better looking, but I have more hair. So
It's true. Both of those are true.
very true. all of them. So
All the above.
anyway, Cassie,
Thank you,
thank you
Cassie.
for your time.
Thank you so much. It was great talking with you today.